It's a Manchu, and I have a new microphone. So that means it's time for another sound check and another story. True story. I used to work as an election inspector for 6 years, from 2007 to 2012. Election inspector is the fancy official title for the poll workers that run the voting sites. I know every state runs their elections a little differently, so I can only speak to how things are done in New York. I worked at the polls on election days during a time of transition when New York updated their voting machines. And the reason for that has to go back to the year 2000. The 2000 presidential election was really close. When most of the state's voting results were announced, it was still too close to call. It came down to who won in Florida would decide the election. Florida was really, really close. Lawyers for both of the parties got involved with multiple recounts of the ballots, and the outdated voting system in Florida was exposed for the whole country to see. It was a system that worked well enough when it wasn't a very close race, but it had some problems with ballots that were not clear, and the ballots could get damaged if counted by machine multiple times. It was a real mess. In response to this, Congress passed legislation that provided funding for every state to update their voting machines. New York did update their machines, but it took a while for the bureaucracy to figure it out. By the time New York implemented the new machines, they'd almost missed the deadline for receiving federal funding. I know a lot of New Yorkers didn't like the change. The old voting machines had levers that you push down to indicate the candidates you wanted to vote for. The machines have been in use for about 100 years. Literally about 100 years. And they were very reliable. People didn't trust the new machines that you fed a paper ballot into. But as someone that worked at the polling site, I can say the new machines are a huge improvement. They're more reliable, more secure. They allow the votes to be more tallied more quickly at the end of the day. One thing that people don't understand about the old machines, they didn't track each voter. There was a counter inside the machine that incremented each time the levers were pushed down. When the polls closed at the end of the day, we election inspectors had to open the back of the machines and write down the numbers on all the counters. So we'd see row 1, column B had a counter number of 5, row 1, column D has a counter number of 12, and so on. It was a time-consuming, tedious process that was prone to mistakes. You have to recognize we were there at the polling site from at least 30 minutes before the polls open until about an hour after the polls close. So we've been working for 13 hours by the time we have to tally the votes. Once we had all the votes, all the numbers written down from the back of the machine, we'd take those numbers to the Board of Elections office where other workers would add them up. The new ballot scanners, they record the vote counts on 2 flash drives. We simply remove one of the cards at the end of the day, put it in a locked security satchel, and one of us delivers it to the Board of Elections office. Back with the old machines, it would take usually until 1 or 2 in the morning to get the results mostly complete and announced. Today, results are mostly announced in time for the 11 o'clock news. Another problem with the old machines was that when things were really busy at the polling site, you could have a line form in front of the voting machine. And first-time voters or inexperienced voters that maybe only voted once every 4 years, they'd come into the polling site and see a line in front of the sign-in desk and a line in front of the machine, and just get in line to vote at the machine without signing in. If there were multiple voting districts in the same polling site, each district would have its own separate machine, and you might have a voter sign in the correct place but vote on the wrong machine. To prevent this from happening, there was a counter on the side of the old machines that incremented each time a voter used it. The poll workers would keep track of how many voters signed in and would be able to verify with a poll worker standing next to the voting machine how many had used the machine. That way, they could make sure that there wasn't anybody voting on the machine that hadn't signed in. But in practice, it wasn't impossible for a few voters to mistakenly vote without having been verified that they were in the right polling site or accidentally use the wrong voting machine. The new scanning machines make this impossible to screw up because the correct paper ballot is handed out to the voter when they're verified and checked in at the sign-in desk. they can then use that ballot at any scanner in the polling site. It's actually quicker for the voter because they never have to wait in line for their turn to use the voting machine. The new machines also accommodate people with physical impairments, blindness, or quadriplegics. There's a ballot marking printer on the back of some of the scanning machines that has a computer screen, headset, and various easy-to-use controls, including, I think it's called a sip and puff device. It's a straw that you can blow into. Before 2008, when these machines were introduced, you had to have 2 election inspectors assist someone with disabilities to read the ballot to them and help them pull the levers. Now they can mark their own ballot privately without assistance. At least that's how they're supposed to work. I never saw anyone actually use the marking device machines when I worked at the polls. The equipment took about 20 minutes to fill out a ballot, and there were a few vision impaired voters who came to my polling site, but they preferred to have the polling workers assist them just as they had before. It was quicker and they were used to doing it that way. One other thing about New York's election system that most people don't know: there are an equal number of Democrats and Republicans working at every task for the Board of Elections. There's an equal number of Democrats and Republicans working at every polling site. And at the sign-in table where voters are verified, there's at least 1 Democrat and 1 Republican sitting at the table at all times. The county boards of elections all have 2 commissioners, a Democrat and a Republican. I don't know if other states do it that way, but that's how New York does it. There's more I could tell you about how the election system works in my state, but I guess I'll save that for another time. I hope you all take the time to vote on November 6th. And when you do, thank the workers at the polls for what they do. Election day is like their Super Bowl. They work really hard from before the sun comes up until well into the night to make sure everything runs smoothly and every voter gets their choice counted. This is Amanchu, and that's my story for today.